The Mafia boss ordered his men to erase a witness, not knowing she'd already erased the evidence that would have destroyed him. She was nobody. A fat paramedic working the night shift in a city that had never once looked at her twice. She was not a spy. She was not a trained operative. She was not even particularly brave. But on the worst Tuesday night of her life, Nora Collins knelt in a filthy Chicago alleyway and brought a dying man back from the edge of death. And in doing so, she accidentally witnessed the one thing that no one in the history of the Ferraro Syndicate had ever survived witnessing. The question was not what she had seen. The question was why, 3 hours later, she was still breathing. And why the most feared man in the city of Chicago could not bring himself to answer that question. Nora Collins had been heavy her entire life. Not pleasantly plump, not curvy in the fashionable sense. She was genuinely, unapologetically large. At 31 years old, standing 5 feet 4 inches and carrying 270 pounds on a frame that had never once known the luxury of invisibility, Nora had learned a particular kind of endurance. She had learned to move through a world that constantly reminded her she was too much of everything. Too loud when she breathed after climbing stairs, too wide for the narrow seats on the Blue Line train, too slow, according to the paramedic coordinator, who left passive-aggressive notes about response times on the shared whiteboard in the break room, notes that were never left for her thinner colleagues. She had learned to ignore it. She had learned to fold herself down and keep moving, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her father had died of a cardiac event when she was 19, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a younger sister who needed someone to hold everything together. Nora had held. She had held for 12 years. She worked double shifts at Chicago Emergency Medical Services, splitting her time between the overnight ambulance route on the south side and the brutal chaos of the weekend trauma rotations at Rush University Medical Center. She had no social life to speak of. She had not been on a date in 4 years. She had long since stopped expecting the world to offer her softness, and she had built her life out of hard, practical things instead. On the night that changed everything, Nora was 12 hours into a 16-hour shift. It was late November. The city had gone brutally cold, the kind of bone-deep Chicago cold that arrived without apology and settled in until April. The ambulance smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, and Nora was navigating the River North district on autopilot, her partner, Darius, dozing in the passenger seat. The call came in at 11:47. Male, unresponsive, possible overdose, Wabash Avenue Alley behind the Blue Monarch restaurant. Nora hit the lights without waking Darius. She had learned to handle the preliminary assessment alone whenever possible. It was faster, and faster was the only currency that mattered on nights like this one. The man was on the ground approximately 30 feet into the alley, half propped against the brick wall. He was pale and barely breathing, his lips beginning to tinge with blue. Nora was beside him in seconds, her knees hitting the damp concrete with a force she felt in her joints, but registered with the detachment of someone who had stopped counting the bruises years ago. She worked. Airway check, pulse assessment. She reached into her bag for the pulse oximeter and clipped it to his finger. 61% oxygen saturation. She moved with the calm efficiency that came not from fearlessness, but from practice, from 10,000 previous moments that had trained her hands to function independently of her fear. She was preparing the oxygen mask when the sound reached her from deeper in the alley. Not a gunshot, something quieter than that. A single, contained, deliberate sound that she recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach, as the mechanical click of a silenced firearm being discharged. Then a body hit the ground in the shadows at the far end of the alley with a sound that was impossibly heavy and final. Nora froze for precisely 2 seconds. Then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, completely unhurried. The footsteps of a man who did not run because running implied panic. And the man making those footsteps had, in all likelihood, never panicked in his adult life. He stepped into the thin band of light cast by the street lamp. Nora did not know his face the way a federal prosecutor might have known it. But she had worked the south and west sides of Chicago for 12 years. She had heard the name spoken in hospital corridors in the tone reserved for things that could get you hurt. She had seen the photographs in the Tribune, the brief paragraphs that never quite said what they meant. She knew who Marco Ferrari was. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that came from discipline rather than vanity. His dark hair was cut close. His coat was black and expensive and utterly clean. He stopped when he saw her. Their eyes met across approximately 15 feet of freezing Chicago air. Nora did not scream. She did not run. She could not run. Not with the man under her hands still fighting for his next breath, and some deep, stubborn, absolutely irrational part of her refused to abandon a patient she had not yet stabilized. So she held Marco Ferrari's gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and then she looked back down at her patient and continued working. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She heard him take 2 steps toward her and then stop. She heard him say nothing. She did not look up again. 40 seconds later, she had the oxygen mask secured and her patient's saturation beginning to climb. She heard a second set of footsteps from the alley entrance, heavier, and she heard 2 words spoken in a low, controlled voice. "Handle it." She did not look up when the footsteps retreated. She did not look up when the ambulance doors slammed shut behind her 3 minutes later. She stared at the wall of the ambulance bay the entire way to Rush, and she thought, with the same quiet practicality that had carried her through everything else, that she had very likely just run out of ordinary Tuesdays. She was right. She made it home at 6 in the morning. She showered. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table, and she looked at the wall for a while, and then she opened her laptop. She had his name. She had the Ferrari Syndicate's name. And she was a paramedic who had spent years treating patients whose medical records were routed through private care facilities that certain powerful families in Chicago used to avoid hospital documentation. Nora had an excellent memory and a very particular professional obsession that had always served her patients well and her social life extremely poorly. 3 years ago, she had cross-referenced an anonymized case study in the Journal of Hematology with a patient profile she had encountered during a transfer at a private clinic on the North Shore. She had filed it away, the way she filed everything, in the part of her mind that never quite stopped working. She sat at her kitchen table, and she pulled the correct journal volume from her shelf, and she read it again. When her phone rang at 8:15, she answered. The man on the other end had a voice like cold concrete. He told her, without preamble, that she was not to leave her apartment. He told her that a car would be parked outside her building until further notice. He told her that this was a courtesy call. Nora looked at the journal open on her table. She said that she understood the situation perfectly and that she did not intend to go anywhere. She said that she would like to leave a message for Mr. Ferrari, and that the man on the other end could relay it, or not, as he saw fit. She left the message. Then she hung up and went to bed. The message was 3 sentences long. The first sentence told Marco Ferrari that his private medical file, obtained under the pseudonym Marcus Farrow at the Lakeshore Specialty Clinic, contained an undiagnosed clotting disorder that his current physicians had either overlooked or failed to correctly identify. The second sentence told him that without a specific protocol of anticoagulant therapy, which she had already written out in precise clinical detail on a single index card left on her kitchen counter, he would very likely suffer a catastrophic cerebrovascular event within the next 14 to 21 days. The third sentence said only this: I told my patient tonight that he was going to survive. I do not lie to my patients. The man who delivered the message was named Sal. He had worked for Marco Ferrari for 9 years. He had seen extraordinary things in that time. He had never seen Marco go completely still in the way he went still after reading those 3 sentences. Marco read them twice. Then he folded the paper precisely in half and set it on his desk. He told Sal to have the Lakeshore Specialty Clinic file pulled and verified within the hour. The verification took 40 minutes. She was right. Not approximately right. Precisely, clinically, documentably correct in every particular. The hematologist his organization kept on retainer reviewed the file and her index card notes and called back sounding, for the first time in Sal's memory, genuinely rattled. He told Sal that without intervention, the timeline the woman had described was, if anything, slightly optimistic. Marco sat without moving for a long time. He had built his life on the principle that information was the only form of power that could not be taken from you by force. He had never encountered a situation in which the most consequential piece of intelligence he possessed had been handed to him freely and without condition by the person he had just ordered to be eliminated. He thought about the woman in the alley. He had registered her size, her uniform, the methodical competence with which she had been working. He had registered the fact that she had looked up at him and then looked back down at her patient without screaming or running, and he had made the calculation that she posed a threat of exposure, and he had issued the order accordingly. He had not registered that she was already thinking about him as a patient. He reached for his phone. If you are watching this right now, you already know this story is different from anything you have seen before. Do not close this video. The part that will break you completely is still coming. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Turn on the notification bell. You are going to want to be here for what happens next. Marco Ferrari arrived at Nora Collins' apartment building at 9:37 on a Wednesday morning. He came alone. This was so profoundly against every protocol of his existence that Sal had, upon receiving the instruction, asked him to repeat it. Marco had repeated it in the tone of voice that ended conversations. Nora opened the door before he knocked. She was wearing loose, dark trousers and a cream sweater with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She had a cup of tea in one hand and a half-eaten piece of toast in the other. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and said that he should come in. He came in. The apartment was small and thoroughly lived in. Bookshelves covered 2 walls, packed tightly with medical texts and journals. There were running shoes by the door and a stubborn succulent on the windowsill. She gestured at the kitchen table and said that he should sit down. He sat down. She set her toast on a plate, washed her hands at the sink with methodical thoroughness, dried them on a towel, and picked up a clear plastic case from the counter. She said that she was going to take a blood sample first because she wanted to run her own confirmation before she started him on any protocol. She said she could have results from the lab by the following morning. Marco said, after a pause that communicated he was choosing to allow this, that she could proceed. She took the sample with complete impersonal efficiency. She labeled the tube, sealed it, and set it aside. Then she pulled the index card from her sweater pocket and set it on the table in front of him. She said that these were the medications. She said 2 were available over the counter, and the third would require a prescription, but that his people would be able to obtain it without difficulty. She said she had written the dosages for his body weight, estimated from his file, and that he should have his physician adjust if the estimate was significantly off. Marco looked at the index card. Then he looked at her. He said, quietly, that he would like to understand why she had done this. Nora considered the question. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She said that her patient in the alley the night before had been alive when she loaded him into the ambulance. She had checked the discharge record that morning, and he had been treated and released. As far as she was concerned, that case was closed. She said that the other matter, his medical situation, had nothing to do with the alley. She had identified the condition from his file 3 years ago and had been uncertain about the ethics of approaching him. The events of the previous evening had removed that uncertainty. Marco said that she was describing a situation in which she had possessed potentially life-saving information about him for 3 years and had not used it for leverage. Nora said that she was a paramedic, not a criminal, and that using medical information for personal gain was not something she did. He studied her face. She had the open features of someone who had learned early that concealment required more energy than she was willing to spend. There was no performance in her expression, no calculation, no fear, or at least no fear that she was choosing to let him see. The quality of her stillness was not the brittle stillness of suppressed terror. It was the genuine stillness of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with the consequences. In Marco Ferraro's experience, people who looked at him like this fell into 2 categories. The first category was law enforcement so senior and protected that they had nothing material to fear from him. The second was people who had genuinely stopped caring what happened to them. He could see clearly that she was not law enforcement. He said that he wanted to understand something else. He said that she had looked at him in the alley and understood the situation completely and had stayed with her patient regardless. He said that he wanted to know why. She said that the patient was not stable. He said that he understood that. He said he was asking about her reasoning. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a tone that was neither dramatic nor particularly emotional, that she had spent 12 years watching people decide who was worth saving and who was not, and that she had made a decision a long time ago that she was not going to be that kind of person. She said that the man on the ground in the alley had nothing to do with anything except the fact that he had been there and she had been there. That was the only calculation that mattered to her. Marco said nothing for a while. He looked at the index card on the table between them. He said, finally, that the man in the alley had been one of his own people, one of his own who had been dealing privately with a rival outfit. He said that he had been dealt with accordingly. Nora said that she knew. Marco said that she had saved a traitor's life. Nora said that she had saved a human being who was dying on the ground in front of her, and that his professional affiliations were not her area of expertise. There was a long silence. Something shifted in the room. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the kind of shift that only becomes visible in retrospect when you look back and try to identify the moment when one thing ended and something else began. Marco Ferraro looked at this large, tired, completely unfrightened woman sitting across her kitchen table from him, eating the last of her cold toast, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt that he was in the presence of someone who was simply, genuinely, without performance or agenda, good. His world was composed entirely of people who wanted something. Money, or protection, or status, or the thrill of proximity to power. Even the people who professed loyalty wanted something in return for it. He had stopped expecting anything different so long ago that he had ceased to notice the absence. He noticed it now. He said, after a pause that went on long enough to be remarkable, that he would like to know her name. She said that she had assumed his people had already provided her full details. He said that they had. He said he would like to hear it from her. She said that her name was Nora. He said that he was Marco. She said that she knew that too. He almost smiled. It did not quite reach his face, but it was there in the quality of the silence that followed. He stood up. He picked up the index card and folded it precisely, the same way he had folded her message the day before. At the door, he paused. He said, in a voice that was lower and less controlled than anything she had heard from him so far, that she should not have stayed in the alley. She said that she was aware of that. He said that he was glad she had. Then he left. 3 weeks passed. Nora went back to her shifts. She ate standing over the sink. She sent money to her sister. She worked the overnight calls that no one else wanted, and she carried her exhaustion with the same quiet, stubborn competence she had always carried it. The medication protocol worked. She received a brief message through channels she did not entirely understand, confirming that the follow-up blood work had shown the expected response. She filed this information the way she filed all favorable patient outcomes, with small, private satisfaction, and then no further dwelling on it. She did not expect to hear anything else. She was wrong about that. On the 22nd day after the alley, she came off a 16-hour shift at 7 in the morning to find a plain black car idling outside her building. She recognized the driver from a single glimpse she had caught of him in Marco's peripheral security detail. She stood on the sidewalk in the gray November dawn, her bag on her shoulder, and her feet aching, and her breath visible in the cold. She thought about the previous 22 days and what she wanted the next 22 days to look like. Then she thought about the alley, and the man on the ground, and the look on Marco Ferraro's face in her kitchen when she had said her name was Nora. The driver lowered his window. He said nothing. He simply looked at her. She said that she needed to go upstairs and change, and that she would be 10 minutes. She was 9 minutes. She came back down in clean clothes, with her hair loose and her good coat on, and she got into the car, and they drove north along the lake in the early light, and neither of them said anything, and the city was gray and cold and completely itself. When they pulled up in front of the building on Michigan Avenue, she sat for a moment looking at the entrance. She thought about all the things she was. She was large and tired, and in need of new running shoes, and slightly behind on her utility bill. She was the kind of woman who had spent her entire adult life being looked through. She thought about the way Marco Ferraro had said her name, not with pity or the performance of open-mindedness, with simple, direct acknowledgement, as if she were a fact, clear and solid, and requiring no adjustment. She got out of the car. She walked into the building. She took the elevator to the top floor, and Marco Ferraro opened the door before she knocked, and he looked at her in the gray morning light with the same quality of attention he had given her in her kitchen, and he said only that he had been hoping she would come, and she said that she knew, and she walked past him into the penthouse, and the city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the silence between them was the first silence in a very long time that felt, to both of them, like something beginning rather than something ending. 2 years later, the Chicago underworld would produce exactly one story that no one could explain. It was the story of Marco Ferraro, who had run the city's most feared syndicate for a decade without a single notable vulnerability, announcing at a private dinner that his organization would be moving away from certain enterprises and consolidating into legitimate infrastructure investment. 3 federal task forces spent the better part of 18 months trying to identify the external pressure that had caused it. They never found external pressure, because it had not been external. It had been a woman in a too large cream sweater, sitting across a kitchen table at 9:30 in the morning eating cold toast with absolute composure, who had looked at the most powerful criminal in Illinois and seen, very clearly, a patient who needed help. And it had been Marco Ferrari, who had spent 36 years in a world where everything had a price, finally encountering something that did not. Nora still worked the night shifts. She still ate standing over the sink most mornings. She still sent money to her sister without fail. But she had stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. She had stopped doing that the morning she sat in a car on Lakeshore Drive and decided that she was exactly, precisely, entirely enough. If this story reached something inside you, if you stayed with it all the way to the end, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with everyone you know who has ever been told they were not enough. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because the stories waiting for you here are the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a comment below and tell us, did you think Nora was going to get in that car? And who do you think Marco Ferrari became because of a woman who refused to abandon a patient in a freezing alleyway on a Tuesday night? The answer is already in the story. You just have to watch it again from the beginning.